Your tongue keeps finding it. That specific, dull, undeniable throb along one side of your jaw, the kind that makes chewing feel like a small betrayal. It's almost midnight, and you're already typing "emergency dentist near me" into your phone. Half panicked, half furious that a single tooth can hijack an entire night like this, turn a full day of feeling fine into a countdown until the pharmacy opens. But the real answer for why this particular pain feels so unbearable and what people used to do about it is far stranger and far older than you'd expect. Humans have been losing sleep to this exact sensation for at least 130,000 years. And some of what they did about it was smarter than you'd guess. Start with the oldest known case because it's almost unsettling how familiar it feels. In a cave in Krapina, Croatia, researchers examining Neanderthal remains dated to roughly 130,000 years ago found something strange on one individual's lower jaw. A tooth that had rotated slightly out of alignment, likely from an impacted neighbor pressing against it, alongside deep, repetitive grooves worn into the surface between teeth. Paleoanthropologist David Freyer, who studied the remains, concluded the grooves weren't accidental. They matched the pattern left by something being deliberately, repeatedly pushed between the teeth, most likely a small stick or blade of grass, used again and again to relieve pressure and irritation from that misaligned, probably painful tooth. This wasn't a modern human. This was a Neanderthal, tens of thousands of years before anyone would call it dental care, already doing something that looks remarkably like self-treatment for a specific localized ache, long before Homo sapiens had even fully emerged as a separate species. Which raises an obvious question. If a Neanderthal could figure out that a stick relieves tooth pain, what did actual humans manage once they started living in permanent settlements? The honest answer starts badly. When humans transitioned from hunting and gathering into farming, roughly 10,000 years ago, something changed inside their mouths for the worse. Hunter-gatherer diets, heavy on meat, fibrous plants, and comparatively little sugar, kept cavities relatively rare. Farming diets built around starchy grains eaten constantly, all day, every day, gave the bacteria living in everyone's mouths an endless buffet. Tooth decay, once uncommon, became a routine, agonizing part of daily life almost overnight on an evolutionary timescale, which meant humans needed a real fix, not just a story about why it hurt. At a Neolithic site called Mehrgarh, in what's now Pakistan, archaeologists examining thousands of years old skeletal remains found something nobody expected. Several molars with small, precisely drilled holes cut directly into the decayed portion of the tooth. Researchers, including Roberto Macchiarelli and David Freyer, dated the holes to roughly 9,000 years ago and matched the drill marks to the kind of tiny flint-tipped bow drills used elsewhere at the site for shaping beads out of stone. The technique required real control. Too shallow, and the decay stays. Too deep, and you risk exposing the nerve, turning a bad problem into an agonizing one. Someone had taken the exact tool used for jewelry making and pointed it at a rotting tooth instead, deliberately removing decayed material through a small, controlled hole, essentially performing the earliest known dental procedure on record. This wasn't a myth or a ritual. It was a targeted, mechanically sound attempt to physically stop a problem at its source, thousands of years before anyone wrote down the word dentist. That drilling wasn't a one-off either. A few thousand years later, in a continent away, in what's now Slovenia, researchers Federico Bernardini and Claudio Tunis examined a roughly 6,500-year-old human jawbone and found a canine tooth with a vertical crack running down from the biting surface, packed with a substance they were able to chemically identify as beeswax. The positioning suggested it had been applied while the person was still alive, likely to reduce the sharp, specific pain that comes from biting down on a cracked tooth and flexing the crack open with every chew. It's not exactly a modern filling, but it's close enough to one that the comparison writes itself. Someone over 6,000 years ago understood that sealing a crack could reduce pain and had the patience and material knowledge to actually do it. So people clearly understood, on some working level, that tooth pain had a physical cause and a physical fix. The Egyptians took that understanding somewhere even more ambitious. Archaeologists have recovered skulls from Old Kingdom Egypt, several thousand years old, where a loose or fractured tooth had been bound to its stable neighbors with fine gold wire. An early attempt not just at removing pain, but at actually stabilizing the structure causing it. Egyptian physicians also left behind one of the oldest surviving medical texts in existence, the Ebers Papyrus, dated to roughly 1550 BCE, which lists specific remedies for tooth pain. Pastes and mixtures involving garlic, onion, and various minerals applied directly to the aching area. Some of it was almost certainly useless. Some of it, particularly the antimicrobial compounds naturally present in garlic, may have done something real, which makes the next part stranger, because for thousands of years running in parallel with all of that mechanical know-how, an entirely different explanation for toothache spread across cultures that had no contact with each other at all. A Sumerian cuneiform tablet, among the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, describes a small worm that gnaws its way into the tooth, feeding on the blood and flesh inside it, causing the pain as it chews. Ancient Egyptian medical writings mention similar ideas. So do ancient Chinese medical texts and separate traditions in India, and later, entirely independently, folk medicine across medieval Europe. The toothworm wasn't one culture's superstition, borrowed and spread along trade routes. It was one of the most widely and independently invented medical explanations in human history, arrived at again and again by people with no possible way to have copied the idea from each other, and it survived, remarkably, well into the 18th century in parts of Europe, prescribed alongside actual surgical dentistry happening in the very same decades, sometimes by the very same practitioners. Does that combination sound contradictory to you? It shouldn't. Not really. The same person who drilled a hole in a rotting molar with a flint bit could still believe, on some level, that a worm was involved because a physical technique and an explanatory story were never actually competing with each other. One told your hands what to do. The other told your mind what was happening. You didn't need the second one to be true for the first one to work. That pattern hasn't gone anywhere. It just changed shape. With total scientific confidence that a cavity is caused by bacteria breaking down sugars in acid that erodes enamel. And yet you probably still, at some point, referred to a bad tooth as angry or joked that it was punishing you for the candy you ate 3 days ago, or felt a small, irrational sense of being personally targeted by a piece of calcified tissue with no nervous system of its own, capable of holding a grudge. Waiting rooms still fill up with people describing pain in oddly personal terms. A tooth that's acting up, a filling that finally gave in, language that treats a piece of mineralized tissue like it has moods. The worm is gone. The impulse to narrate the pain as something with intention behind it never fully left. Even the home remedies carried something real forward, buried inside the folklore. Clove oil, passed down for centuries as a toothache cure long before anyone knew why it worked, contains a compound called eugenol, which genuinely does have measurable numbing and antibacterial properties, confirmed by modern pharmacology centuries after people started reaching for it out of little more than habit and hope. The story around it was often wrong. The instinct that led people to it, generation after generation, wasn't. Think about what that means for the throb you're feeling in your own jaw right now, or the one you'll feel again someday. The specific dread of tooth pain, the way it seems to occupy your entire skull, the way it makes eating, talking, and sleeping all feel compromised at once, isn't a modern overreaction to a minor inconvenience. It's one of the oldest, most consistently documented forms of physical suffering in the archaeological record. Serious enough that a Neanderthal reached for a stick. Serious enough that Neolithic farmers picked up a jewelry drill and pointed it somewhere far more delicate than a bead. There's something almost grounding in that if you let it be. The specific private misery of a bad tooth at midnight connects you to an almost unbroken chain of people, going back tens of thousands of years before your own species even existed, who felt the exact same localized, maddening ache and refused to just accept it. Some of them told themselves a story about a worm. Some of them wrapped a loose tooth in gold wire. All of them eventually reached for a tool because a story alone was never quite enough to make the pain stop, and on some level, everyone involved seemed to already know that. So the next time your tongue finds that spot, the dull throb you can't stop checking on, remember what you're actually part of. Not a uniquely modern inconvenience, not a punishment for something you ate, a problem so old and so universally unbearable that it pushed a Neanderthal to whittle a stick, pushed a Neolithic farmer to aim a bee drill at their own jaw, pushed an Egyptian physician to wrap gold wire around a stranger's tooth, and is currently pushing you toward a phone at midnight, typing the exact same underlying request every one of them was making in their own way. Please, someone, make this stop. Your tongue keeps finding it. That specific, dull, undeniable throb, still exactly as unbearable as it's always been. But this time, whether it's a phone in your hand or a flint drill in someone else's, you know exactly what you're doing. The same thing people have been doing for at least 130,000 years, refusing to just live with the pain.